Hello, we're back. It's just me and Andrew today. We're going to risk walking along some woods along the roadside to see if we can hear the heron babies that are in this nest above us.
Yeah, there's about 5 or 6 separate nests right above us. Oh, maybe even more, maybe about 7.
And they're normally really noisy, but
They
seem to have silenced themselves.
one of the nicest things about the heron nest is they have these really beautiful blue shells. They're about the size of chicken eggs, give or take, but they have a much darker blue than any shell I've ever seen before. And you can find them on the ground. You just sort of pick them up, and they're really very nice to look at.
Oh look, there's one, his leg.
Oh yeah, it's been crushed.
What I like about the baby herons is that they sound like baby pterodactyls.
Yeah.
Not that I know what.
No,
baby
but I
pterodactyls,
imagine
that's
that's
what I
it.
imagine.
They're very like they kind of have like a loud kind of guttural squawk. It's not a beautiful call.
It's not a beautiful call.
And their nests are sort of big and messy and very, very high up. So it does sort of feel like walking underneath a pterodactyl nest.
Anyway, enough of the rambles. We are just here because we wanted to talk about strength training. Well, we've just come to the end of our Strong for Life course, and it's always a nice time for reflection for us because the course is mainly aimed at people who wouldn't want to go to the gym but know that they want to get stronger. And it is progressive strength training, which for us is quite a small wedge of the pie.
Yeah.
From what we normally offer in our classes. But it's a really kind of fun course to deliver because while you are helping people understand what progressive strength training is and how they can keep going, what you're really doing is just helping them give themselves permission to have a go and at stuff that they genuinely find terrifying.
Yeah. And also seeing, it's a way for them to kind of check in with their body and seeing what it feels like to push themselves and get a sense of what heavy is as well. That's been one of the most interesting things, especially the lower body stuff like the hinges or the deadlift variations, is people will often start off so nervous about them. And by the end, they're obviously just running out of things to lift because they get so strong. And that isn't reflection. I'm not saying the program is super effective, which, I think it is. But it's just because they gain familiarity with these movements and they realize they're capable of so much more, which is, I guess one of the things that we think about all the time is what are the barriers that stop people from engaging in physical activity and exercise and progressive strength training and all these other things that we think are important. And it's very, very rarely physical limitations. It's almost always going to be emotional, psychological things. And a lot, we have this period at the beginning of the course where we're really just focused on familiarization. And I would say the majority of the course is not even focused on the strength training aspect of it, is getting people comfortable, ready. Even if we get people lifting right away, what we really find is that it just takes a few weeks before people really gain that confidence to start pushing themselves. And then once they do, they realize that they really enjoy it. And that's a lot of the feedback we got, is just how exciting it is to sort of be engaged with movement and not have it feel obligatory.
Agreed.
Yeah.
I think what we wanted to actually talk about today, though, is from that basis, once you start and you start moving more and kind of finding this new confidence in your body and confidence in your own abilities, the world starts opening up in a way that you could never really have imagined. And suddenly you have access to all of these different movement opportunities everywhere you go. So I'm just thinking about, somebody was saying on the call the other day that there's a wall that they normally have to get down using their hands when they're gardening. And she thought, I'll just give it a go and jump it. And she did, and she was fine.
Yeah.
And that, to me, is really joyful. But it brings in this concept of kind of real world strength or life-based strength that is our kind of bread and butter, and that we deliver in our in-person classes and in the in-person course, it's a lot. We do a lot more of that than we do of progressive strength training.
Yeah, overt progressive strength training.
Yes.
Let's say, yeah.
Yeah. And so what we've been trying to get our head around in the last few months is how can we kind of start to make sense of all of this real world strength, life-based strength training, and not systematize,
Yeah.
but just sort of draw a picture so that if you wanted to start thinking more broadly about building capabilities as you get older, and so you can keep doing all of the things that you love to do, what would be a useful framework, I guess, for you to kind of start thinking about it.
Yeah.
Is that fair?
Yeah, I think that's good. One of the things I wanted to jump on from your previous statement about people gaining the confidence or looking around, jumping over walls or seeing other opportunities, it's one of the things we talk about all the time, but expanding one's field of affordances or just perceived affordances. And you can create this great feedback loop of as people gain in their physical capabilities or even their confidence, they see more opportunities to engage with the world. And when they see more opportunities to engage with the world, they engage with the world more. And then it creates this really nice virtuous cycle of people moving more and more and more. And that's really what we want this upcoming course to be, is to continue with the progress from Strong for Life, but really get people out and engaging with the world around them so they can start creating this positive feedback loop. And
there's that bit in, I want to just talk about affordances quickly, because if you haven't heard of affordances, it might be useful just kind of talk about that a little bit. There's that really good analogy in the Todd Hargrove book that we talk about on the in-person course. He talks about a climbing wall, and to a novice climber, they could look at a climbing wall and not really make sense of it, and therefore they wouldn't be able to navigate it. Whereas if it was an experienced climber, they could look at it and find a route, and then they just scramble right up.
Yeah.
And it's sort of seeing those movement opportunities wherever you go, and suddenly the more confident you are in your body and your ability to navigate your environment, the more options are available to you.
Yeah, and this is true of play as well. Like, kids who grow up with access to woods see all the different things that they can do in the woods, whether it's, playing with sticks or climbing or whatever. They can perceive these affordances so they can have more fun, so there are more opportunities for play. And it's also kind of tied into gyms as well, in that the way modern gyms are set up is you have all these very specific, explicit machines that tell you exactly how you're supposed to use them. This is the bicep curl machine, this is the leg extension machine, etc. And there are reasons why that's perfectly okay. There's not really anything wrong with that in certain situations. But what that means is it doesn't really expand your perception of affordances, because you sort of think of movement as sort of being this reductive combination of body parts and muscles and things like that, as opposed to going out in the world and engaging with it, where often you can train I guess your muscles or different capacities in very similar ways, except it's out there doing practical things rather than just repeating a very isolated movement over and over and over again. And one of the reasons that gyms are designed the way they are is because people don't often perceive these opportunities for movement, because they haven't really grown up in a way where they can engage with the world like that.
Had the opportunity to do it, yeah.
Yeah.
I think it's worth talking about the systems of movement thinking that come out of the gym.
Yeah.
Do you see? Well, there was a conversation you had the other day around, like Dan John and his. I mean, there's loads of these. Like,
yeah. So,
what are these movements that we need to be doing, all the time?
I mean, this is one of those questions that people try to address over and over and over again. The question is sort of like, what is a human being capable of doing? What are all the different, functionings some people say that humans can do? And people try to tackle this over and over and over again. It also depends on, identifying your why. What is your purpose? So if you're someone who grew up in the 70s or 80s and you went to the gym, you'd be thinking about bodybuilder, body part splits, so you might be thinking specifically about muscles, like, okay, I'm going to do legs, shoulders, whatever. And you would have this body part split, and the goal would be to get your muscles as big as possible, for aesthetic reasons or whatever. And then there was this reaction against it, probably starting in the late 90s or so, where you started getting these functional movement patterns. So instead of saying, oh, you need to work on your quads, people would say, well, you want to work on, your squatting patterns or your kneeling patterns, or, instead of saying you need to bench press, you say, well, you should get a certain amount of pushing in, a certain amount of pulling in. And then, maybe perhaps some locomotion or twisting or whatever. There's lots of different models, and they're a big improvement, but they were all mainly still assuming that you were either engaging specifically with exercise in a gym or doing gym-like movements outside. But there's lots of different angles, sort of from the perspective of occupational therapy and occupational statistics. People look at, well, what do people need to do in a job? What kind of capacities do they need if they're working in a factory? So again, it might be like core strength, balance, endurance, pushing, pulling, fine object manipulation. But sort of what you find is once you start getting into this, you start getting these taxonomies, and you end up with these big long lists of like, here are the 52 different physical, tasks that every human should be able to do. And different organizations have sort of chimed in. The WHO has a new one, or a fairly new one, called the ICF. And that's quite a progressive one, because it really looks, it sort of is inspired a little bit by the capability approach of Nussbaum and Sen. But it's sort of this idea, like, what does a human being need to be capable of in order to live a fulfilling life, while also accounting for limitations that people might have, whether it's through sickness, or injury, or lack of opportunities and things like that. And they try to list out all these things as well. And what I like about that one is a bit more holistic, because it also looks at social barriers. It looks at emotional barriers, things like perhaps like anxiety and things like that. And I don't want to get too deep into this, but I think it's interesting because you can look at this from two angles. What are humans capable of doing? And how do we ensure that we create as many opportunities as we can so people can develop and grow these different capabilities? But another way of looking at it is, what's preventing people from engaging in these activities? And I think one of the weaknesses of coming in with the gym-centric model is that it often assumes that the limitation in a movement is going to be strength-based, which is very rarely the case. When we're talking about sports, performance, and things like that, or getting people to do specific
top end
top end stuff,
athletes,
then that might be the case in specific movements, and it can be the case for general population as well. But by the time strength becomes a limiting factor, what I mean is there's so many other things to consider, like, is the person leaving their house? Does the person have the confidence to move in a park? Does the person have the confidence to even get to a gym? And it's not just about the social stuff, but if you only focus on thinking about strength being a limiting factor, you don't look into these other things about why people might not be engaging in this different kind of movement.
Yeah, I think that sort of crosses over with my general beef about optimization.
Yeah.
Again, because the whole, social media is a world of madness, but the whole idea around optimization really only applies if you're in, you're training for something very specific, or an athlete, or you're, whatever. If you're just me, or you, or really anyone who's not one of those people, you don't need to be worrying about that. You just need sort of broad brush capabilities. Yeah. This idea of kind of life-based strength training. Do we want to go into a bit more detail?
Yeah, I guess there's two things I'd like to talk about the optimization. It's something that bothers me as well. It's one of the reasons why I generally don't like the framing of calling people athletes. Certain organizations like CrossFit will call every member an athlete, and I actually find that very limiting. Just in that, especially if we are thinking about a sport, it's very easy to do a needs analysis of what a football player needs or a baseball player needs or whatever, and say, okay, well, we need to increase your 100-meter sprint, or decrease your 100-meter sprint time by X amount or whatever. But life is much more complicated and complex than that. So it's not like one can just have like a simple spreadsheet of everything you need to train for. But at the same time, I think it is an interesting question to ask. I guess going in with that, you know, back to what I was saying about all these different models for making sense of human capabilities. So yeah, you end up with a lot of people trying to do these taxonomies, these big giant tables of all the different movements that humans should be doing or could be capable of doing. And then things always fall through the cracks, you know, it always ends up being like, okay, well, you know, what about kneeling? What about, you know, what about sprinting? What about squatting? What about hanging? What about all these different things? And then what you start to see is maybe in the late 80s, I think, is really when you start to see papers on this. I'm thinking of Carl Newell's papers. And, you know, he has this idea of constraints-led approach. And what he was trying to do, one of the things he's trying to do is to get away from this idea of trying to list everything, because it's just too complex to account for everything. So he said, like, look, if we just kind of look at everything from the perspective of a task, like any task that needs to get done, you know, picking something up, running from A to B, getting over an object, you know, more complex things, you know, participating in sport, etc. You're looking at three things. You're looking at the individual organism, so in this case, the person trying to complete the task. You're looking at the specifics of the task itself, you know, in terms of what's being asked. Are you trying to score points in a certain situation? You know, are you trying to survive? You know, what does it mean to succeed in a task? And then you're looking at the environment. So you're looking at, you know, things anywhere from like, is it wet or dry out? Is it light or dark out? Is it slippery? Are you doing it in a crowd? Are you being assessed at the time? And he says you can look at pretty much any activity that a human can engage in. And instead of trying to start with a big list of everything, you just kind of, if you start with a task and you think about what the constraints are of the individual, the environment, and the task itself, then all of a sudden, what you can start doing is you can start designing challenges that can help sort of build up all these different capacities or constraints that can help you engage in things like this.
So let's take an example.
Sure.
Of a task.
Yeah.
So that we can explain what we're talking about.
Yeah, well...
let's say, I don't know, playing more with your grandchildren, so getting down onto a picnic blanket.
Yeah, so I think you can talk about that really well, because it's something that comes up in Nature Moves a lot. But I'll say, I just want to cut one thing off in case anyone's listening. It's like, okay, a task is squatting. And in one way, a task could be squatting, but one of the things I want to emphasize is not leading with the idea of what the movement is supposed to look like in this context. And what I mean is, just because you think squatting is good, a task would not be saying, okay, I want you to squat 10 times.
Let's think about the why behind the squat.
Let's think about the why behind the squat.
So why has squatting become the thing that everybody talks about? Well, I guess it helps you get down to the ground.
Yeah, I mean, I would rephrase the question. I would say, what are squats useful for, and where does that movement pattern show up in the real world?
And how can you find challenges that would elicit a squat without directly telling somebody to do a squat?
Yeah, or is a squat even a real thing? Is you know, I mean, not to get too philosophical. But you know, there's not really one kind of squat. You know,
squat-like movement.
A squat-like movement. So I think we can ask is like, why would people squat? Why do you see people squatting in the real world? And squatting can be a resting position. You know, squatting can be a way to sort of move your center of mass from high to low, or I guess low to high, and it might emerge sometimes if you're trying to pick something up. Though I think what you find is actually very rarely is squatting used as a pickup pattern. And very rarely is a squat bilateral. What I mean is this idea that you get your stance just right.
The perfect squat.
So it's perfectly
it's a sort
even.
Of whole family of squat-like patterns.
Yeah, so instead, let's go back to what you were saying. Let's think about this idea of a picnic. So if you're working with someone who's a bit older, and they're a bit nervous because they know that they have a family picnic coming up in a few weeks, and they're sort of worried about what kind of, they wouldn't say this exactly. People wouldn't say, oh, I'm worried about the movements that might emerge in a picnic context, but it'd say,
no, but this comes up really often in our Nature Moves class, is when we talk about what are the movements that you're worried about as you're getting older, or you started to avoid, you notice yourself starting to avoid, and really often it is some kind of, I really want to continue playing with my grandkids. Yeah. And then more specifically, we've had this quite a few times, is I want to play with my grandkids on the ground and it not be an issue. I don't want to overthink it. I don't want to, a couple of them had bought camping chairs so that they could go to the park and they wouldn't have to sort of take part in the sitting on the blanket part.
And that's what I was getting at, is nobody says, oh, I'm worried that I've lost my ability to squat. People will talk about it in terms of the tasks or the situations, these sort of embedded contexts where movement occurs. So they'll be, and say, oh, I'm worried.
To interrupt, I think we're about to get drenched.
Okay, well, we can run to the woods if that's the case.
Okay.
So, you know, people will say, oh, I'm worried about getting down to the ground. And if you're starting with this sort of prescriptive lens, it's like, okay, that means we need to get people squatting more. And you say, okay, well, fine, we'll get you stronger at squatting, because if we, you know, strengthen your quadricep muscles and your hip extensors, you know, et cetera, then that's going to make those muscles stronger and you are going to be able to get down to the ground easier. But that is almost never the limiting factor in why someone can't get down to the ground. And it could just be that maybe a deep squat isn't available to them for a number of reasons. You know, maybe someone has had a hip replacement or has some sort of impingement, a structural impingement in their hips, or maybe, you know, over the 75 years of their life, they've, you know, had some sort of, you know, injury to their spine, you know. So what we're seeing is actually you could have access to that position, so you can think of it as mobility. You could have issues with specific pain. You could have, you know, it could also just be fear-based. So classic example, one of our members who had a double knee replacement was sort of casually told by a doctor that she shouldn't get down on her knees. And
you should be careful of not overusing things.
Yeah, and that was interpreted as I should never bend my knees. So she spent 15 years not bending her knees because of this fear. So, you know, what I'm saying here is not leading with the specific movement, because if I said, okay, well, we're going to do some squatting, that's going to make you better at getting down on the ground, that's A, probably not true, and B, there's a very good chance that squatting patterns are not going to be appropriate for someone, especially not to do it over and over again, depending on what their limitations are. So what they're really saying is, I want different options for being able to get down to the ground. And that's where the task base comes in. Because anything, okay, well, let's find different options for getting you down to the ground. So first off, can you get down to the ground with some other kind of additional aid? What if you had a box or a tree trunk or a rock around? How could you use that? How would you get from a standing position to sort of a supported position, you know, maybe like a raised quadruped position? Could you get down on your hands and knees? Then from there, could you get your bum to the ground? Then from there, could you sit comfortably? Could you reverse that? So you want to first establish what's the most basic way that you can achieve that task. And then you want to start thinking, well, okay, how can we make this look more like the real world? And sometimes we'll talk about, you know, this idea of designing representative tasks. So it's like, well, are you going to be holding something? What if you're holding a glass of wine in your hand and need to get down to the ground? So is there a way we can work on that? What if, you know, what if you're holding a baby and you want to get down? Can we start adding some resistance in that way, in a way that is actually going to carry over to the way that people might really move? You know, what if you have a way of getting down to the ground, but actually you find it quite embarrassing because you sort of flop? And even though you can actually do the task, you're not comfortable doing it in a social situation. Can we build up more options there? So we've completely removed this idea of just training the squat for the sake of it. And now what we're trying to do is we're trying to look at all these specific constraints that we can layer on to the movement of getting down to the ground. And then from there, we can start playing with all these other movements that come out of that.
Okay, so let's talk about from there. So what?
Yeah, so what?
Where do we go from here? We know that we need progressive strength training for bone density and muscle mass, and also for, you know, confidence in that, in the sort of understanding what you're starting to understand what you're capable of. But then there's this whole other world of real world strength, life-based strength.
Yeah.
So what does it look like?
So, I mean, I think what we're really talking about here is like maintaining the ability to participate. And when people talk about formalized strength training, you know, in the background, what they're saying is, well, we're doing this to fight concepts like frailty or osteoporosis and things like that, because you want people to continue to be able to participate in life. And I think actually, if we use that as something to focus on, I think that that is a very good way, or a very good lens to look at. So I'll use a sort of a classic example of formal strength training versus something that's informal but might have more benefits. And the big hope in progressive strength training is A, okay, you're gonna get stronger, and B, you can increase your bone density or, whatever needs you might have. But the hope is that there's going to be, this idea of skill transfer, this idea of by doing leg extensions, that's going to help you climb up the stairs or walk up the stairs with groceries or jump or whatever. And what we find is that's not always necessarily true, because skill transfer is sort of a different consideration. So I'll talk about that. Let's say you have two siblings, and at one level, they each want to get better at pull-ups, and they use two different strategies. So one of the siblings, we'll just say that they're brothers in this case, one of the brothers decides he's going to follow a pull-up program. So he's going to do some kind of pull-up program where he buys a pull-up bar, he does X amount of pull-ups every single day or every other day, and maybe he adds weight to the pull-ups, maybe he tries to get a higher number of pull-ups, whatever. So that's one brother. The other brother decides that they're going to join a climbing gym or a bouldering gym, and they don't do any pull-ups the whole time, but what they're doing is they're going out and they're climbing and they're developing the skill of climbing and perceiving routes, and while they're doing that, they're also getting hip mobility and grip strength and various kinds of shoulder mobility and core strength. And also while they're doing that, they're meeting other people in the gym and they're making friends and they're learning from the people. Those people are giving them tips as they get more into climbing. They're going out onto climbing excursions or weekends where they go out and, climb on cliffs and things like that. They continue to make friends. And you see all these sort of downstream benefits. Meanwhile, the other brother is continuing to do their pull-ups. If you checked in with them, say a year and a half later, both of them are going to be much, much stronger. If you ask both of them to jump up on a bar and do some pull-ups, they're both going to see an increase. But the brother who did the pull-ups is probably just going to see an increase in pull-up strength and other movements very similar to it. The brother that did the climbing all of a sudden is going to be participating in way more facets of life. And that skill transfer is going to carry over to other things. It's not just going to be the climbing. It would be the parkour. It would be yoga. It would be going out to parties. It would help them with social anxiety. They'll probably spend less time on their phone, and all these other things, all these benefits that are going to increase people's capacity to participate in the world around them.
Yeah, climbing and parkour are a really good example of something that has sort of broad skill development and also has that social element. Like, I've never been to a climbing wall where I haven't chatted to people.
Yeah, it's just very friendly.
It's a very chatty place, and you can only climb so much. You spend quite a lot of time sitting on the mat looking at routes and being a bit tired and chatting to people about the routes.
Yeah.
And actually all of that is built into it, and it's such a nice way to train. And it's the same with parkour, in that it's inherently social, and you get really sort of fit in the traditional sense, like in a way that you become really capable.
Yeah, and going back to that example of skill transfers in one direction or the other, I think everyone, well, not everyone, but people have stories of working with people who do parkour, have never stepped into a gym, and the first time you have them do a deadlift, they're capable of a double body deadlift or something like that. And while there could be some selection bias in there, it's because they've built up all those capabilities like power production and strength through jumping and landing and running, from all these different angles. And the reverse wouldn't be true. If you had a power lifter who had a very high deadlift personal record, they would not be able to engage in a lot of the jumping and other movements that a parkour athlete does. So the transference is asymmetrical. The more you have this generalizable real world training, the more it applies to. Whereas what I often find is the strength and the capacities developed in the gym are very narrow and sometimes quite fragile as well, in that a lot of times they're sort of based on these hyper specific situations, and they often don't transfer.
Yeah, so I think if I'm keen not to ramble on too much, but maybe the big takeaway here is progressive strength training is really great for lots of things, in terms of bone density, muscle mass, confidence is a big one. But within the gym environment, it can kind of open doors in terms of your understanding of what you're capable of. But then it often kind of ends there.
Mm-hmm.
And I think if you want to start thinking about more varied movement patterns, more of this life-based strength training. We can link here actually to a few of our blog articles and some good places to start. But a nice way to think about it at home maybe this week is to think about these ideas of sort of task-based challenges. So rather than thinking about, right, I'm going to go and do, let's say you do, I don't know, 10 deadlifts with your barbell. Just trying to think of something like very mundane.
Yeah.
That versus maybe setting yourself a challenge, and quite often we'll do kind of scenario pickups with actually a lot of our classes, which is where you completely throw out all of the prescriptive side of coaching and you kind of create a scenario where people have to think about how they would solve the problem. So one would be when your kids are young and they're just constantly falling asleep in your bed and you've got to try and pick up a sleeping, pretty heavy toddler from the middle of a double bed and you got to get them out. It's quite hard. So there's no way you can deadlift that because they're sort of wiggly and the bed is all wobbly and you're definitely like trying not to wake them up. So you have to kind of shuggle and sort of, I don't know, shuggle and wiggle and kind of hold on to them and then get out of the bed and then take the shuggly thing and put it. Often we had quite a long period of our lives where children were sleeping in mid-sleeper beds, like cabin beds, and then you have to like sort of get them up here to your shoulders and then you're going to kind of very gently roll them into quite a high bed. And all of those movements are so useful and so overlooked because there's so many kind of weird movement patterns in there that you couldn't categorize if you tried. So maybe that's the takeaway, is to sort of think about different scenarios through your week. Like, yes, continue with your progressive strength training, but start thinking about different opportunities and different scenarios where you can get into these novel positions and challenge yourself a little bit, whether it's picking up something weird from a weird position and not thinking about how you do it in terms of the form, because there is no real, when you're outside of the gym, form doesn't really matter because all the objects are such weird shapes and the environment is completely different. Is that a good takeaway?
Yeah, and I'm just thinking of other examples as well. I wouldn't say don't even think about form, which is true, you don't even think about form, but think about what different forms might emerge depending on the environment and the task constraints. So what I mean is, if you are at the airport and you're waiting for your heavy bags to come off of the carousel, there's a very specific movement that kind of emerges where you're sort of getting through the crowd, you don't have much of a spot, you see your bag, you have to figure out where the handle is or where you can grab it, and you just have this like half-second option just to kind of go in, grab the thing and shift it over. And that is something that just doesn't exist in the gym. But you do see movements like that all the time, if you're hauling sacks of flour or whatever. So that would be, what I really like thinking about, like you were saying, is what are these different scenarios? What are some ways that you have to move things? Imagine a day at the airport, moving things around, trying to get to the flight on time while you've got all this different luggage on you, getting something into the overhead compartment. These are all different movements that are sort of related to what you see in the gym, but actually much, much different expressions of similar task families. So I always like to, think about where do we see these movements show up? So think like a day of grocery shopping, a day of gardening, a day of travel, and just start thinking about all those movements that are there and how you can kind of play around with variations of those movements.
Yeah, and sometimes we use this in our warm-ups as well. So rather than doing a prescriptive warm-up, which we do still do a lot of prescriptive warm-ups. So the example of a prescriptive warm-ups, like, right, everybody, I'd like you to march out and skip back and then do some Spider-Mans or whatever you're working on. An example of the kind of emergent warm-up or the scenario warm-up would be taking people on a walk. Imagine that you're about to cross a stream and you've got some stepping stones, and that allows everybody to, you can say, look, some people, maybe if you're feeling more confident, the stepping stones might be a little bit further apart. Maybe they're slippy, maybe they're not slippery. You can give people different options to solve those problems, and then it means that no matter what stage of confidence they are, they can participate in some way that's meaningful for them and challenge themselves a little bit if they're feeling that way inclined, or just have a nice time. But it's also a nice way to think about weaving it into your day, like, oh, I need to get my lunges in or whatever. So actually, is there a way that you could get into a similar position by setting yourself some different tasks? Sometimes we'll do in a warm-up just to start getting people thinking about twisting and reaching and starting to get down. It could be take a step, see if you can pluck a blade of grass, take another step, see if you can pluck a different blade of grass, and every time you pluck a blade of grass or pick a leaf up, try and do it slightly differently. And you'll see some people who are maybe more confident really get these big reaching and stretching positions in, and other people are just trying to focus on getting that blade of grass and coming back up again. And that is completely fine, because that's the appropriate level of challenge for them for the day.
That's great.
Anything else to add? Well, we managed to get all the way home, lost both dogs, and we haven't got soaked.
No,
so
didn't
there
get
we
rained
go.
on.
All right, well, that's enough of our rambling. We'll put some links in the show notes. We've got a webinar coming out on Wednesday that's on all of this in a slightly more structured manner, on sort of real world strength versus gym strength, and how it's the kind of two sides of the same coin, which we'd love you to come to. And if you've missed it, you can of course have access to the recording. All right, see you soon.
See ya.